Hey YouTubers, this is Jonathan, and I'm here today to look at another game from Zurich 1953. Today's game is quite a famous one. There are actually already several videos about this game, and it's in a lot of books, which sort of tempted me to maybe skip it. But I decided that if it was that important, it was probably worth including in my collection of Zurich 1953 games. This is a game between Reshevsky and Petrosian. And it's also interesting because it's the first game that I'm including in this series that ends in a draw. But perhaps is also one of the more exciting games that we're going to be looking at. So we get a Nimzo-Indian from Petrosian with the black pieces, and we get pretty standard development here. And we'll just get through this quite quickly. Here he's challenging. He's gonna force black to decide if he wants to take or not. Which, given that the pawn here is on c5, is almost obligatory. Okay, and then in here, Bronstein in his book makes an interesting note. He suggests that yes, that this position definitely is cramped for black, but also says that that's not really that important. Because if you enjoy playing cramped positions, you're going to have better results in them, whether or not they're theoretically considered good or bad, which sort of suggests to sort of a larger idea of playing good versus bad openings, that if you play any sort of normal-like opening, you're probably fine, as long as you enjoy the positions, because the advantage you get from enjoying the position is probably going to trump any disadvantage that the position actually has in itself. And that's probably true for 95% of chess players. Maybe at the very top that make a difference, but not really for most of us. So we get some exchanges. He's getting rid of his isolated pawn, and so he plays here bishop b2, which looks like a weird move because he's just shutting in the bishop here. But he has sort of two ways of how to deal with the two bishops that he's got here, because that is the advantage that he's picked up out of this opening. He can play a4 and try to put the bishop on a3, or he can take on c4 or c5 and then play c4 himself. But currently there are some problems with each of those moves. So after d takes c, b takes c, c4, then black can play rook b8, which sort of causes him to not be able to play bishop b2 immediately, which so that's one problem that way. And if he goes the a4 route, we get c takes, and then bishop g4, which Bronstein suggests that this would inhibit white from going down this line, but this looks very similar to what ends up happening in the game. So I'm a little bit confused of why this should dissuade black, but he says that it does. Perhaps it's because of the lack of pawns on the c file now, and that if we do get this capture on f3, perhaps it's not as good of a version of it because of the play that black might get on the queen side, which he may not get in the version that we're going to look at a little bit later in the game. So instead of either of those routes, we see bishop b2. So his plan now is to capture on c5 and then play c4, which black stops that immediately by playing c4 himself. Usually when I see this kind of a move in my own games, I'm usually quite happy because it makes e4 much easier to achieve because there's no pressure on d4. And so I usually like this because I feel like I have a fairly clear objective to know what I'm heading for. And we see essentially that in this game. So after bishop c2, we get bishop g4. Now, I mean, I would have been tempted to play bishop e2 to prevent this pin, but I suppose that the bishop on c2 is a better attacking piece than it is on e2. So white immediately jumps out of this pen and tells black that if he's going to capture the knight on f3 and do the pawn structure damage, he has to do it immediately. I accidentally flipped ahead there, so anyone who hasn't seen this game just realized that black chooses not to do that. So Bronstein in his notes says that the standard explanation for why bishop takes f3 was not played is that white has the two bishops. He's going to have a strong center and the open g file. But he kind of suggests that that if white tries to take advantage of that immediately, that it's not really going to be that advantageous for him. So if play like the g takes, knight h5, then e4 immediately, we get knight into f4, king h1, because the check was coming in with a mating problems. So here and then there would have been an issue. So we got queen h4 and bishop c1, knight d3, bishop takes, and after this, he says that the pawn on d3 is untouchable, which it is. So if he captures immediately, then rook takes e5 work, and he says that this is probably okay for black. Although I have to be honest and say that I would take white, I think, in this position, mostly based on these two pawns is the main thing that I like about them. But I suppose similar to the game, there could be a way to blockade them, but it still seems like this pawn is probably going to fall, I think, soon, because he just can play rook over to d1 or something. It doesn't seem like it's going to be that difficult to pick up that pawn. Even so, he demonstrates a clearer plan. So if we go back after instead of e4 here, Bronstein gives a sort of an interesting development. He says playing f4 and sort of slow playing this position with moves following up with f3, like queen f2, rook ae8, and then bishop c1, king h1, and only then playing e4. Now, obviously, white can't make all these moves in a row without black doing anything about it. But this was sort of the development scheme, and that this looks much stronger for black or for white. And I agree that this does look pretty dangerous, and probably not a position that I think black wants to play. So which demonstrates going back why he chose this knight e4 move instead. So we get knight d2. Going back again, I forgot to mention that queen e1 is interesting because queen d2 seems perhaps more natural because it connects the rooks, but it takes away this square from the knight, which he's planning to use. So I thought that was a nice little maneuver. So we get knight d2, we exchange, bishop h5, because he knows f3 is coming next. He doesn't want it to come with tempo. So we get f3, immediately going to go for f4, bishop g6, and then we get e4, and so queen d7. Excuse me. Rook a1. He's just similar to the build-up that I showed after we take. After black would have taken on f3. He's bringing both the rooks over. He's going to get the bishops involved, and he's going to probably look at playing e5, f4, and just steamrolling. So because of that steamrolling, the e5 and f4, f5, black is obliged to take. And we get now he's going to try to put some pressure against these two pawns. He's got to stop them from advancing further. So we get queen f4. Also interesting to note here is if instead white were to play a4 with the intention of playing bishop out to a3, getting that bishop active, which would be a good way of doing that, we get knight e5, and then bishop a3, knight d3, takes, and then takes here on h4. And this should be a good position for black. Now, he's going to have a better bishop because of these pawns here on dark squares. He also is going to have good pressure on e4. It looks like the light squares, especially in the center of the board, are quite weak, and he's going to have these outside pass pawns to get play with. So that's why no a4 was played here. So we get queen f4, and then b5, and b5 is just to prepare a4 and also prevent a5. Or sorry, prevent a4 and prepare a5, so that later in the game he may be able to produce a passed pawn. So bishop d1. Now it makes sense for the bishop to be on this diagonal because it is a nice attacking diagonal. But right now it pins this pawn because it's an undefended piece. So he wants to be able to play e5, but he can't do it with the bishop on c2. So he decides to reroute the bishop. We get rook e7 and queen e8 against this, and so just continuing to line up here against the pawn. So we get e5 and a5. So after rook e3, we get rook d8, again just trying to put all of his power in front of these pawns to try to stop him, and white continues in like fashion. So right here is the critical moment of the game. White is planning to play e6, and then something like this may ensue, and he's going to pick up a pawn after queen e4. After queen e4, he's hitting the knight. He's also hitting on h7. So even if we get rook over to e1, he's still going to probably could take on f7. Or sorry, not f7, but h7. So this position looks pretty tough for white. For black to handle this. So this is what he's sort of dealing with, and black finds a really interesting way to prevent that problem. Instead of going down this route and trying to play e6, Bronstein shows that white could have chosen an entirely different attacking scheme that would have, he said, had good chances of success, just playing h4 and then h5 and following up with rook g3, and suggesting that he had good chances to succeed in an attack like this as well, which would have prevented the idea that Petrosian comes up with. So going back here, if we look at the problem is how do I blockade on e6 and d5? And Petrosian comes up with a fantastic idea here. He plays rook e6. So he's freeing the e7 square for the knight to come to d5. After a capture, he's going to put a pawn on e6, which just is a manual blockade here, and then also controls d5 better. And he's getting rid of this very nice light squared bishop, which is going to leave this strong bishop unopposed. And then he's going to put a knight on d5, which the knight on d5 is clearly going to be better than the bishop on b2. And frankly, given that there are no open files at this time, probably his minor pieces are going to be able to outplay a rook. So after e6, Reshevsky doesn't even take. He plays a4, hoping for a capture or for playing b4, because after b4 he could get d5, rook takes, and bishop takes, rook e6, and queen xc4, and his blockade is not going to be so strong as it is in the other lines. This bishop is going to have dramatically more scope. The rook now occupies the square the knight would like to go to. We have an open f file and an open open d file, and we're probably going to get an open c or an open b or both soon. So this is clearly favors the white position. So instead, we get knight e7, just continuing with this plan. And now Reshevsky feels compelled to capture. So we capture. He goes queen back to f1, in order to keep an eye on the pawn on c4. If he played something like queen f2, Bronstein points out, we just get knight d5, rook moves, and now b4. And this is better than previously because the knight's here. He's still going to have a bad pawn on d4, and he's going to end up with connected pass pawns here, or he could even just play. He's even going to play maybe just b3, queen takes at some point, and then have connected pass pawns over on the queen side, supported by this bishop, and then later the rook here. So we play queen f1 and knight d5, of course, rook f3, and he plays bishop d3. And Reshevsky feels compelled to give the exchange back here, because the bishop on d3 is really a pretty brutal piece, controlling a lot of important squares and really gumming up the works for the white position. So we get captures, and he gets a pawn out of the deal. He is he is a pawn up now, but after b4, Reshevsky has a tough decision to make, which Bronstein suggests that psychologically this was quite tough, because after the move played in the game, which is c takes b4, he says a draw is almost a guaranteed result here. If he wanted to play for a win, he needed to play c4, but after knight b6, rook c1, knight x a4, and bishop a1, queen c6, it's not terribly clear who is going to win this. We have, again, the connected pass pawns for both sides. The blockade may be better for maybe better because he still has a pawn here on e6 and some pressure to some hanging pieces. It's going to be it's really double-edged, and who knows who's going to win this. And Reshevsky, sort of famous for being in time pressure, didn't have the time to really calculate all of these lines to make a decision if he wanted to go down this road. Which is why he takes, we take back, and then after a5 we get rook a, immediately touching the pawn, rook a1 to defend, queen c6, and bishop c1, which Bronstein says tempts black to consider playing rook takes a5, rook takes, queen takes c1, but after queen f1, give a check, h1, then playing h6, which actually I think is probably inaccurate. This line should probably be with h5, and you'll see why here in a second. h6, rook takes, or not rook takes, rook check, h7, queen b1, g6, and rook a7. And notice here, if he had played h5, he would be able to play king h6. But there's no reason why black needs to go down this line. He's not any worse, and this position doesn't really look winnable for black to me at all. So instead, he just plays queen c7, just further attacking the pawn. We get a6, queen b6, just keeping a couple pieces against the pawn. We get bishop d2, b3, queen c4, h6, just luft, h3, same, and after b2, rook b1, king h8, and bishop e1, a draw was agreed. So quite a fantastic idea. If we go back looking at this position when he played rook e6, where was that at? Rook e6, right here. Really a fantastic idea. Melik on chess.com has a lecture about this, and he was a student of Petrosian's, and he recalls listening to Petrosian talk about this in this position, and said that it wasn't easy for him to come up with this move. It wasn't like he just immediately thought of this and just played it automatically. That this sort of exchange sacrifice was difficult for him as well, but he really didn't see that he had many alternatives, and it did give him some strong blockading. There's some other factors that I think help make this a move that's something that we could come up with on our own, just this key blockading idea, the lack of open files, and the strong minor pieces that black gets in return. I think make this something plausible that we could come up with. Anyway, I really enjoyed this game, and I hope that you guys do too. And we'll see you next time. Thanks a lot. Bye bye.